Call the Public Works Committee meeting to order, please. And if Anne Marie would take attendance.
Sure. Mrs. Labuda.
Here.
Mr. Benson.
Here.
Mrs. Geiger.
Here.
Mrs. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Sorensen.
Here.
Mr. Ruiz.
Here.
Mr. Samuelson.
Okay, Cora had asked me last month if we could go over the timeline and how we got from A to B on the jail, because there was questions that were unanswered, and we do have an executive meeting next Tuesday with GGA, and then I think sometime in February we should have LaBella in.
I'm sorry that I
No,
hope
it's
it didn't
fine.
take a lot of time for people, but
No,
this is a
you have-
snapshot, so I can at least
Right.
catch up.
Okay, so we're going to start with the first page. So Josh, if you would just
Start with the word.
with the 2000. Okay. Go ahead.
So the non-colored packet you have is a presentation we'd kind of done back in the late summer of 2013 that kind of gave you an idea of how we got to where we are today, starting in 2005. So I'll just run through this relatively quickly. If you have any questions, just stop and ask. So in 2005, there was a resolution in March 17th that directed the then county manager to proceed with the process necessary for proper site selection and construction of a new jail for Sullivan County. Then in May of that year, there was an RFP issued for professional architectural engineering and construction management services for the new jail. As you can see, there was a committee set up that interviewed the respondents and came up with a recommendation to award the contract. You can see that process took quite a long time. I mean, you're going all on that from May all the way into January of 2006. There was then a resolution that authorized a contract with LaBella for $7.4 million, with a contingent of $300,000. And in that same resolution, there was a bond resolution, or authorized the county treasurer to issue a bond resolution. Just note that out of that 7.6, the county has borrowed $2 million of that 7.6 to date.
So that bond doesn't expire?
Bonds resolutions expire after 10 years. So if nothing is done with that before January of 16, you would have to then pass another bond resolution.
Okay, so I guess the part where I'm confused about is that that amount wasn't what was borrowed, that was what was approved to borrow.
The board authorized up to that amount and then directed the treasurer at some point to only borrow $2 million of that. The contract had contemplated a multi-year. It wasn't a contract that was going to be all the deliverables done in a year, so there's really no point in borrowing the whole thing in 1 year. And the bulk of that 7.4 is for construction management services, so that firm would have boots on the ground for the 18 months or 2 years it took to actually build the jail. So there's really no point of borrowing the whole 7.4 million. It was contemplated at the time that you would borrow in pieces as you needed it.
So we did or we didn't borrow 7.6?
You have authority to borrow up to that. We have borrowed $2 million.
Okay, so we only borrowed $2 million. We did not borrow 76. We had the authority to borrow 76, but we only borrowed 2.
Correct.
And of the 2 that we borrowed, we spent it
Correct.
on?
LaBella.
Okay. And what we spent the $2 million on was for their plant.
Well, they had. You can, when we get to the colored page, they kind of were tasked with a couple things.
It was more
in the
than just
initial. They assisted in great length on site selection, and at the same time, they also were tasked with the design. So initially there was the 2 tasks that they were working on. The total RFP and contract really has 3. It would have site selection, designs, and then construction management. We obviously aren't at that point, so they've kind of gone through the site selection and are approximately 80% of the way through construction documents.
I guess the part that I'm not clear about, I'm a little bit confused, is if that resolution is in operation until 2016, then what authority does this particular legislature have? Do we then reenact the remaining part, or how does that work with one resolution still kicking over?
like I said, bond resolutions are effective for 10 years.
Right, so this
so
one's effective until
You could
2016.
use that old bond resolution to at some point direct the treasurer to borrow additional money for a vendor for design of the jail. You don't necessarily have to pass another bond resolution.
Just keeps you from having another vote.
Pardon, John?
Just keeps you from having another vote.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, it's still in operation, it can be in.
The authority exists, but we still, as a body, would have to direct the treasurer to go out to market and borrow a portion of that. You wouldn't likely to tell him to borrow all at once. It would be a couple million or whatever the number turned out to be for any given year. This legislature would direct the county treasurer to go to market for a portion of the balance.
So I guess my question is, if up until that point, right, January 26th, and 2 million was appropriated to Labella out of this almost 7.7 million. And up until that point, it was just the 2 million was used by Labella to get to that point. There was no site chosen. There was.
Well,
what
that
It wasn't
included,
sale,
that
there wasn't.
included work.
Well, the 3
Early
sites.
on, that was their
Well,
initial.
in 2007, though, it says 3 sites were identified, so they didn't choose a site yet, but yet Labella was appropriated 2 million, so I'm just.
No, they didn't get the 2 million all up in January of '06. The board borrowed at some point 2 million, and then we were paying them as they were vouchering us, as they invoiced
Okay,
us.
so
It wasn't
that
that they just
carried
got a
us
check
to-
for $2 million in
Well,
January.
no, for what work? I guess that's my
Their
question.
design to date.
Site selection and design,
Site selection and
to where they
design.
are today with design.
Okay, so that's,
On the facility that
Yeah,
they were able to start some of the design, which would be generic to whatever site you chose. And then they did some
Did some
site
specific
specific
to
once they
each
selected that as a site.
so up to now, it's 2 million that Labella received for the work that they did thus far.
Correct.
Okay, got that.
So after the authority to bond, and there was a couple financial study done by a firm named R.S. Lynch and Company. They at the time were doing a couple things, studying the jail, building a new jail, and also the landfill expansion project that was on the plate at the time. So as part of Labella, they came up with a huge list of potential properties that kept getting narrowed down, and they were working with staff and also the COC to make sure the COC was on board with some of the properties. So and early on, that was a lot of their tasks were trying to get a site. So you can see in March of 20, the COC had sent a letter to the county sheriff approving 6 sites. The Summit County Airport, the community college, MAPE site, and then 3 other privately owned properties in the town of Thompson. And at that point, the COC wasn't going to entertain any other sites at that point. I think so. They were making us choose from one of those 6 at the time. Then in June, we designated ourselves as lead agency under the secret process. And then in 2008.
I'm sorry, I hate interrupting you, but you said 6 sites and you named 6, but I'm only seeing 3.
We didn't list them all. There was 3 other privately owned, private landowners. There was consideration within the town of Thompson.
So at this point in time, when we're talking about 2007 on the timeline, we had 6, but we bought land. We haven't bought land yet.
There was a back and forth between county staff and then the COC at the time, and then with Labella involved the COC had to kind of give us an okay for sites. You couldn't just unilaterally pick a site and without the COC being involved. So we gave them a larger list than 6, and they came back at some point and approved 6 sites and said pick from one of these 6.
So
But
we
they-
limited it down here to 3 of the 6 that was picked.
They were chosen to be the
There were-
preferred sites. out
There
of
were
the
6 between, and then there was staff was comfortable that with these 6, and then the COC was on board that said, well, you can choose from one of these 6. at the time. There wasn't a firm decision made in 2007 at that point. It was just a back and forth. And then we had a sheet that at the time had the pros and cons of each site and
Right.
the potential cost for utilities.
Cost breakdown.
Yeah, so it kind of was like, you had your ideal if you had unlimited resources, we go here, but then obviously there's cost associated with each site. So we kind of got it down to a place where it was something that was operationally okay, the central location, and then financially was suitable.
So, in 2007, we had not yet determined the site.
No.
Okay. So sometime after that is when the land was purchased for the
Yeah,
land site?
so we had a generic, we did the lead agency thing for the seeker generically, and then in 2008, there was a resolution that authorized the county manager to proceed with the environmental review, acquisition of land, design and construction of a 303 bed facility. Then in July, there was a designation of lead agency for the seeker process. Then this was specific to the MAPE, so this is like the first action that the board took that kind of, it didn't tie you directly into the MAPES, but it was an indication that that's where the site was where the location was headed. There was then a resolution for a land surveying services for the MAPES site.
Out. Didn't you ask Annie who was in and who was out?
Sam was in out.
So at the same time as the sites were working on sites, Labella is working on designs, and they had come up with them at the time in 09, where their plan stand was in about the summer of 09. They had designed the jail for the 256-303, and then that was about what you hear as the $80 million jail, roughly.
And was that a Department of Corrections recommendation for 100 beds over what our?
They were originally requesting us to build more. We went up
450.
and made our
I said,
case
"No way."
that we felt we could build to 256, and then they okayed that. They agreed with our figures, and we're going to allow us to build at the 256 level. So at that point, the board was not was looking to potentially find a way to reduce the cost of that $80 million jail, and engaged a vendor by the name of Zuback Owner Representation that came in, and their purpose was to take the Labella design and try to find some engineering ways to reduce the cost of Labella's original design. And then they came back with a report that had a myriad of things that some at the time the board accepted and some didn't accept. Like, for example, one of them was to reduce the core, the kitchen, the laundry, those facilities to be at the 256 level. The board at the time didn't really agree with that and wanted to build the core at the bigger to allow for expansion. It was more financially and operationally, it was probably a better decision to build the core out bigger than having to tear down walls and disrupt operations and potentially have more costly renovation work down the road as you build more pods.
So where are we at right now with capacity in this iteration?
The design is still, the Zubakin didn't change the amount of pods we would build originally, and so you'd still be at the 256-303 with double bunking. The core facility, the kitchen, the jail, those core things, the visitation would be built for the max build out of, was it 500?
Approximately 500.
500.
So you wouldn't have to go back in and knock down walls to expand the kitchen or expand the laundry room or expand visitation.
You'd have to add equipment to the kitchen to certify it. It wasn't building out the facility to certify it. It just was the space allocation was so that it would be easy to add
So
stuff.
square footage increased.
It becomes very costly to add it on later.
Later on.
Where if you're building
Where
it, it's.
did we get to the 500 number then?
Because they want you to,
That was the study for the future
for
of the
the-
jail, that ours is going to continually.
to last 100 years like
require
this
more.
jail, and eventually the county's gonna grow, we're hoping, and if you have, 300 1,000 people here all year round
Yeah,
when we have these.
the design would allow you to add pods on. You'd have your core facilities built, and you could add on pods in cycles as if the population was increasing. The 80 million wasn't contemplating building all the pods. That was the 256 pods for 256, but it did have the core at the max capacity of the site. Correct.
That drives up the cost quite a bit, I guess,
No, it's very, it was, to cut it out versus
Yeah.
the cost of doing it later was not a, it was very minimal.
It's not a huge difference. You get into a lot when you have to,
It's
if you
cheaper
have an
initially,
active
yeah,
jail,
it's built more.
that you now have to shut down to add on and do it, your costs go up exponentially on doing work in an existing facility to add on to that, where the pods would just be dropped in place next to a pod. It gets built completely separate of that, and then it's just connected, and it's a very short, minor disruption.
So from a design perspective, that's about where the board then did a couple secret-related things and issued a negative declaration in the September of 2009. Then in September of 2009, there was a contract for the purchase of the Mapes farm, and that process involved a Mr. Steve Hunter that would be an arbitrator to determine the final purchase price. We had an assessment, and the private landowner had an assessment, and they were apart. So this arbitrator was going to come in and determine fair value of the property. So up front in that process, we issued a bond and paid about $1.175 million for the land initially, and then you can see as you go down into 10, there was another $820,000 paid. So the cost of the property was just shy of $2 million.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So at this point, the county has spent $3 million. It's the $2 million from the resolution in January
Roughly
2006. Oh, sorry, $4 million. I can't add right now.
It was the $2 million for Labella roughly. I mean, there's some other things like the Zubac, and I can get you an itemized list of all the things we paid. But for argument's sake, it's around the $4 million figure. $2 million for land, $2 million for Labella.
But they're separate bond issues, so that means that you're still carrying that $5 million that's still unauthorized, that was authorized from that previous bond.
Well, that hasn't been borrowed, and then the two bonds have been treated somewhat differently. The Labella is still in a short-term bond, or what we call a ban.
That's
That couldn't
this,
be.
That's this one here.
That's
is
the
the
$2
ban.
million. That can't be converted or couldn't be converted to long-term until you started construction of the facility. So we're paying that off over a period of 5 years at this point. So we're getting close. I don't know I forget the exact year it's paid off, but you're getting close to having that $2 million paid off. We're making roughly $400 or $1,000 payments a year against that over a 5-year period. The land has been converted to long-term. That wasn't necessarily tied into having to have started construction. The design had to be able to, it's a little complicated, but state finance law requires you to have started construction to be able to roll that in as the overall project.
Okay, so
To convert it to long term.
So we can safely say that at this point now, as of 2009, the $4 million was spent.
Correct.
Okay,
I
got
mean,
it.
it'll be a little bit higher than that. As you can see, there was some stuff done for like the land survey and some of the secret stuff costs. I'll get you it exactly, but
That's all right.
it'll be a little bit north of $2 million, but right around, or $4 million, but right around $4 million.
Yeah, we're getting to that milestone.
But that
That's
$4
really-
million that was spent was the original amount that the original bond was 76?
Well, there's two separate bond
And
resolutions. There
then
was,
we did, then another bond of approximately 2 happened, so the 76 turned
Not
into
76.
96.
7.6.
7.6 million.
yeah, technically you would
Not
have the
76
7.9, is it? 7.6 million and
It's less than 8 million.
and the
And
2
plus
million.
the 2, so it actually was
But you've only
9 that
borrowed
was
4 out of
authorized.
that.
So the board in the past authorized approximately 9, and of the 9 that was total that was authorized in 2 separate bonds, 4 has been spent.
You've borrowed and spent 4.
Except one was a ban, not a bond.
The Labella ban is currently a short-term ban that will
Right.
get paid off. The land has been converted to a long-term note.
Okay.
All right.
So subsequent to the final purchase price of the $2 million for the land, then there was a resolution in July of 2010 that declared the Mapes property as the location of the new jail. You can see that it was withdrawn because the board at the time wanted to look at some land next to the Apollo. So then in the very next month, the Apollo had dropped off, and they formally declared through resolution the Mapes farm as the location of the new jail. Within that resolution, they did some other things as well. That you can, they committed to the 256 size facility, inclusive of the core area that is appropriate for the full build out of the complex. Of what we had talked about. They had committed to a geothermal heating system at the time, and we had looked at a lot of energy things, and that was one of the ones that had a relatively quick payoff. That would have been paid off before the expiration of the useful life of the geothermal system. But obviously that would be something going forward we would probably need to revisit as technology has changed. You're 4 years beyond what the technology was at the time. So at this point, I mean, there's some other things. At this point, the process pretty much stopped at that point. Obviously, going back in history, we're in the middle of a deep recession. We're having severe budgetary problems, and the project basically got pended until the financial picture improved within the state and county. So that's kind of from an internal process prior to what recently we've been doing. In 2013, as you're aware, there was a controller's report that recommended building the jail sooner rather than later. And they had some projections in there about what you would save over a 50-year life of the building versus operating the existing facility. And they had a chart in their appendix that projected the debt, including the debt and the operational cost of the new facility versus the old, projected some deficits in the early years and then some surpluses from building versus operating the old jail. And at the time, and we need to relook at their numbers due to interest rate some changes and stuff, but at the time when they issued the report with the then interest rates, not counting the couple years that it would take to build the facility and you're operating the old jail, you were looking at about a 2.5% tax increase. That's likely going to be higher due to interest rates have slightly gone up since then. I mean, it won't change that number in a huge way, but it will likely be a little bit higher at this point. So, and the main thrust on why that number isn't bigger is they're projecting about a $2 million savings on staffing from having to have less posts in the Padre design versus a linear design. So they have all the operational costs, and then you're adding on the new debt service, but at the same time they're deducting this $2 million roughly of less operational costs due to the staffing.
So, can, just at this point now, because I think I had mentioned it at some other point, there's nothing in here that says what happened to the annex option. Did that just never make it in 2005? It had already been discounted prior to that?
Well, that
July 8th.
I'm
yeah,
sorry,
that-
where are you?
July 8th of 2010.
Right here.
That wasn't really an
sorry.
option when the original
Right.
letter from the COC came out because it was still being operated by the state, so it wasn't
Right.
it wasn't a vacated facility at the time. The then legislature and staff looked at the facility, and the board at the time made a decision that they didn't necessarily want to spend more money to determine the feasibility of building there, and there were some presentations about the transportation costs being burdensome over the life of the facility versus having a more centrally located jail that are next to our courthouses.
Okay.
So that's it. It may not be specifically spelled out in this presentation, but there was discussions and determinations made that the Mapes site was the ideal site.
And then the other question I had was with regards to linear versus pod. At this point now, the COC will only approve pod versus linear?
Well, I think Hal's here. Hal, could you answer that question?
Hi,
Because
Hal.
you've been
Hi.
with the commission for a couple months now.
Yeah, I mean, they just don't design the linear style anymore, it's all direct supervision.
Right.
The reason
Okay.
for that is to have the officer interact with the inmates, he's more aware of what's going on in his pod, and it's better control.
And that's the design we saw at the Delaware
Down,
County
yes.
Jail was.
One CO for that whole.
And that's about 10 years old now, that
Correct.
pod?
So there's really just the operational thing that they're driving, but even from a financial, you want to have the least amount of posts per inmate, so that affords you to have less posts than you would have in a linear jail. So operationally and financially, I think it makes sense to have the modular design.
Josh, was there ever a financial impact analysis over the construction period of the jail? Obviously, if we authorize the construction, it's gonna take, I'm gonna guess, 2 years to
Yeah.
construct it. But you wouldn't be borrowing the $80 million on day one, you would be
No.
gradually drawing down that bond, so it might take 3 or 4 years before you have the full debt service on the 80 million. And then there'll be a period of time where you're operating the existing jail as you're constructing the new jail, and then once the new jail opens, then you'll be closing the old jail and transitioning over, so which you'll have operational cost savings. But I guess, as I'm thinking it, just in my mind, there will be a period there where, there's gonna be a little bit of a peak cost, and then it's gonna drop back down again, and I'm wondering if there's a way to,
Offset that.
perhaps graphically illustrate
Yeah,
that.
we could do that and kind of, it'd be a somewhat of a best guess at this point about how, we'd have to make a determination of how much we think we'd be borrowing year one to construct during that period versus year two to finish the project. But yeah, we can come up with some figures on what that would look like, because it's, even if you were at the number the controller's estimating, you're gonna have, like you said, a blip where it's gonna be higher than that, because you're gonna be taking on debt but not realizing the savings over less posts.
Exactly,
So-
and I think people have to realize going
Yeah.
in, that's gonna happen.
Yes.
There's some overlap.
Yeah, you're gonna have probably a minimum 2-year overlap where you're gonna be, by the time you get bids out and then award, you're probably gonna have about 18 months to 2 years of construction before you can open the door and have the COC say it's okay to start putting inmates in there.
So was there
They don't
ever,
have a long-term savings.
Yeah.
sorry, Josh, was there ever, in this period, discussions about setting up specific funds, like we have the, landfill closure fund, we have this fund, we have that fund? Has that, is that gonna help us in any way to establish a fund going forward?
Yeah, I mean, going forward it would. At the time, there was just, we were kind of doing
There was
all we
no-
could to hang on and not, during the recession, so it was, financial, if we had the money, would have made good financial sense to do, but there was just no ability to fund to have funds available to fund a fund of that sort. I mean, going forward, as things are slowly improving and you have this excess fund balance, you've kind of designated some stuff for public works, but likewise, you could also designate, if you have, get more, you wanna shift some of that money to the jail project, you could move additional fund balance into some of these things that could potentially, what Alan's referring to, help offset potentially some of this 2-year gap, where you can maybe use some of that to, where you use it to pay some of the debt in that short-term period where you wouldn't have this big blip. You could like,
Pension smoothing?
yeah, you could smooth out that impact where you wouldn't have this mid to high single-digit tax increase, but then drop down to 2 or 3%. You could smooth that out.
I mentioned this a couple of months ago, but it didn't go anywhere, but I think that the next 2 or 3 years, we should take $1 million out of our debt, out of our, surplus and put it aside and designate it as the jail, because like, Josh says, there's gonna be that period where you don't want the tax increase to be too high, so if we can set aside a couple $1 million, we can offset that. That would be my recommendation.
I think that would be
Yes.
a good idea. 'Cause
2 or
it will
3
be
million
a-
would be a
It's
help.
gonna be 1 or 2 year blip.
Right.
And
Cindy?
Josh and I had kind of gone over the numbers, and for the $80 million proposal, if you have about 4 to 5% interest over 30 years, your interest and principal payment is between 4.6 and about $5.2 million.
Yeah, it'll depend
So
on the
if you-
interest rates at the time, that's why there's a
Right.
range.
But if you look at, you know, the interest and principal repayment of the debt, you're outboarding, even with your savings of your workforce, because I think that was about $2 million,
Mhm.
it's still gonna exceed boarding out.
No.
So, yeah,
What
it
level
will.
of boarding out?
Well, if you're currently boarding out, right, what I'm trying to say is, we don't have to do, I know that the jail, we have to do something, but to do it, rush into it right now, I think with, the debt repayment is gonna be, what we pay out every month is gonna exceed outboarding costs. So that's why some counties outboard, because it's,
Yeah, but you have to have a jail.
I understand that,
So
but
you can't just, it's not just a case of saying, well, it costs this to have a jail, it costs this to outboard. You have to have a jail and the people anyway. So if our jail can only hold after what's fallen down falls down, we either have to build a small one and outboard, so you have all the personnel costs, all the building costs, for whatever that size is. Plus,
They're working on something.
the outboarding costs that go on
I know.
forever. The bond you pay off in 20 years.
But here's the thing
The
also
outboarding
is,
costs never go away.
no, I understand that part of it, but, if there's a waiting period for, like, I had a conversation yesterday, if this casino project comes to reality and we become the host county, and I think the governor's projections were, host county $13 million. So if, as a legislative body, if we designated a percent or portion of that 13 million to cover this debt service, then there would be, you know, the impact to the taxpayer would be less, because we'd be using the revenue coming in from the governor's host county 13 million. So I'm thinking we could start the discussion now. I had a discussion with Josh yesterday, and he was gonna work up a resolution to start the discussion. If the governor's gonna make a decision come maybe June or July on whether Sullivan's host county, and we as a legislative body have a designated fund set aside for that, I think it was 5.2 million, somewhere around there.
I mean,
And then
that would
that
be the-
money would be set aside for it. The problem with it is that until that 13 million came into the county as revenue, there would be that period of time that the jail would be, I don't know how long you can wait. I know obviously you've waited since the discussions of 2006, but it seems to me, is there any way that even if we started off, like Kathy was recommending, setting aside money to get us through that transition period, and then when those casino revenues kick in, then that designated fund goes to pay off that debt service.
but you know,
How can you set up a dedicated fund if you don't even know if you're
well,
gonna get that money?
well, here's the problem, the casino.
Get ready now when
The
it comes to
casino,
understand that.
even if,
13 million.
once the casino is approved, it's gonna be 2 to 4 years before that casino is up running, we see any money from us. Let's say it's gonna be 4 or 5 years at least.
But
We
we're talking
can't,
30-year bond,
yeah, but
right?
we cannot wait, in my opinion, we cannot wait 5 years to start building our jail. We're talking about it for 9 years already.
The other thing you can't.
So,
if we-
so wait a minute, hold on a second. So Cindy's talking about, we're spent, I think, we're gonna spend, I think we've spent $1 million in transporting the prisoners to another prison. If we had, another jail, if we had that $1 million right there, that would offset the money, because we're not gonna send anybody out, we're gonna have a new prison. So I think you have to take all that into consideration.
Well, I don't know if it's a 30-year bond, and like Kathy says, there's a gap of 3 to 4 years. How do you, if that revenue comes in as the host county, then that could be, I mean, I'm not talking tomorrow or next year, maybe even not the year after, but I'm talking, if you're talking a 30-year term, to set aside a portion of that ahead of time to pay that down. That makes sense to me, because then you're not taking it from You're
I
taking
think-
it from revenue.
That's what you would,
I think
But-
there's a couple of questions here, if I'm
Kitty, then
thinking
Alan.
clearly. Two things are gonna be happening potentially near the same time frame. We potentially would be building a new jail and potentially becoming a site where we'd have an income stream. I don't know how the bonds work. I know how I've done my personal finances. Instead of making a double payment on my car or my mortgage, I set so much money aside and I pay on the principal. I'm thinking the similar thing, but I don't know if you can do that, pay off a bond in advance.
You can set aside.
You cannot. You cannot pay up a bond in advance, so that doesn't seem to be a possibility. The other piece to me that would be important to know is even if we were looking at doing something along what Cindy's saying, which makes sense to me, I don't know when you're talking about gaming, other places in the state, in the nation, have received monies from gaming, and you don't necessarily know what the other cost factors are involved when you get a benefit. You know, sometimes a friend of mine many years ago left New York, thought it was cheaper to live in Texas, and he found out his water bill was higher than anybody's heat bill. So there's costs that we don't necessarily know now that we can't even imagine that gaming, maybe that's why the host place gets the 13 mil, because there's a cost
Absolutely.
associated, and so that money would not necessarily be able to be set aside labeled jail, because there's costs that we don't even know about. Is there a way to even look at that?
Well, I think that's currently either started or going to commence about looking at what the host impact is going to be, whether it's roads and bridges or your law enforcement, your sheriff, probation departments, and even potentially you could have some impacts on your social services depending on some of the salary levels and stuff that come in. So yeah, I think that's going on. We don't have any numbers right now on what the potential impacts would be. But I know there's some prior studies that have looked at this, but you're talking probably over a decade ago when those studies were done.
But this cost of the jail will be one of the largest capital projects in the history of Sullivan County, right? So if you think about the implications financially, and if the governor makes a determination in June or July, and we are the host county, and you got 13 million, to me, for the largest capital project, it would make sense to set aside a portion of that money to cover that bond.
That's 4 or 5 years,
repayment.
I don't believe we can wait that long. You're talking about
So, yeah,
Alan, and
That's
then,
his bridge, I think. We're sitting here looking at a 30-year bond, you know what I'm saying? So it's kind of short-sighted for us not to say, you know, let's get some of those revenues
but
in
my
and prepare for that.
we can't, in my opinion, we cannot wait 4 or 5 years and start talking about building the jail.
I'm not talking.
No, I'm not
Well,
saying
she's
that.
I'm
saying-
saying set aside money, that if we know that we're the gaming site and I thought the date was November of 14.
But you're
not-
still not gonna see the money till-
November, then it's 2 years
Right.
for it to be built, so
Then
you're
it's-
not gonna be looking
See,
at
but-
revenue for another year.
Right, so
Yeah, but
it's
this is a
4
30-year bond, so we sitting
So
right
you're talking
here
about
could
4 years
prepare.
minimum.
Okay, Alan had his hand up. Alan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Prepare for that.
Yeah. And we also only get 50% of the money that comes back to the county.
Which was, I
The
think.
township gets a
Township
portion
gets
too, right?
50% and the county gets 50%. If that's 11.2 or whatever the original number was, we're talking about $5 million that would be added to our budget.
Okay, that was 13, I think, for the
Alan?
host county, so
Okay.
the county gets 50.
I will,
50%.
Alan, you have the floor.
one thing I would like to see, would be an impact on rising interest rates. Right now, we're at historically low interest rates, 1%.
Yeah.
And, anyone who has a mortgage knows difference in a few points can make a substantial difference in your mortgage payments.
Exactly.
So, and I can guarantee you they're gonna go
Go
up
up.
from this point. Don't quote me on that. I don't see the interest rates going down. So that has been a concern of mine for the last couple of years. It's not that I'm chomping at the bit to build a jail. I think we need as we're doing, you know, go through it methodically and see how we can reduce the cost to the greatest extent possible, but those historically low interest rates are not going to be there much longer. And I think it's something that we have to factor into the equation. So that's my point.
Okay. All right, Hal, did you want to add anything? I don't, okay.
I'm good.
And,
Thanks.
go ahead. Okay.
So on the
One,
Before we get to that, before we get to that, September 9th, 2013, we're going into contract with GGA to conduct a study not to exceed the 2,500. I was assured that they were going to look at the Woodburn Annex site. I want to know if that was done.
you'd have to ask them when they come on Tuesday. They'll be here Tuesday.
They haven't looked at that
Okay.
site, no. The answer is no at this point.
So at some point, when the legislature decided to move ahead with the purchase of land, that any other options were basically set
Take it
aside?
off the table.
Right.
the board at the time, yeah,
And-
determined Mapes was the site.
And so, do you recall what options were on the table?
Sure, we had,
There was the original 6 from the COC letter from back in 2007, and then when the once the state vacated the annex, there was discussions that commenced about potentially using that structure or that site. That started, I forget what year that was, probably in late 08, 09,
Yeah.
somewhere around there,
Yeah, I think.
That they started,
in the middle. It was
knew it was coming.
Yeah. I
So
think
once
we
that became
probably
vacated, the county then began conversations with the state about about them potentially selling us that site. There was discussions, and then, like I said, through that resolution, the board at the time chose Mapes, having looked at the
July
original 6
2010.
and the annex site, and it's some land at the Apollo.
I think it was, we took us, took the COC and the sheriff and this body, I think it was 2 years to even select the site. The site has been selected, that is where the jail is going to be built, the resolution was passed. Unless you have 5 votes to rescind that resolution, that is where the jail will be built.
So on the chart, that's the color chart, it basically, the green, yellow, and blue mirrors kind of the presentation, and then going down on the page on the left, that's the site selection that took place that Labella helped us with, and then going across the top in the blue is more of the design and the financial analysis tasks that have taken place, and then the last box has the GGA study. So that you can see the orange then has the next steps going forward where you are pretty much currently today. So there's these high-level 3 options. You keep the Labella design, or update it from their design in 09, or you have them redesign their plan based on the Zubacken report or any other cost-saving ideas or energy efficiency initiatives, or you reissue an RFP to seek a new company to complete the jail design. And then all those 3 will then, depending which path you take, feed into plans being finalized, bids being issued and awarded, and then construction.
Cora?
So if you go up to this blue 1, 2, 3, the third box, Zubatkin reviews plans provided by Labella, did Zubatkin ever give their comments back to Labella?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
We incorporated some of their
Some, but
changes,
not
some
all.
we did not.
All right, you'll see in the
Some
middle box,
did and
middle
didn't.
orange box, it says that Labella redesigns current plans based
Oh,
on
I'm sorry.
Zubatkin.
Yeah.
I missed that.
So that's where we are today. You're in that top of the orange section, and then depending on which path they all ultimately end up in bids and finalized plans and bids, but you're in that middle section of the orange, those 3 options. So that's where you are today. And obviously GGA is coming next week to present their
When are they coming?
Tuesday at
Tuesday at
11 a.m.
11.
They will be doing a public presentation.
That's the 14th.
Correct.
And what about the meeting on the 13th?
What about it? There's a meeting on the 13th with the committee, correct.
So who's on that committee?
At this point, it's myself, Kathy, and Alan. Then it's
The
the
sheriff.
sheriff, it's the
Josh,
Josh,
and treasurer,
and the treasurer
county attorney.
and county attorney, right?
One of
Monday at 3. It's not open to the public.
So the,
Did you say that?
I had 2, always Ed.
I just have my final question,
Yeah,
Josh.
Yeah, no, he did say that.
Yeah,
Sorry, just my final question is, if we go back to, July 17th, 2013 with the controller's report, because that's kind of what got us kick-started again. And evaluating financing options, which is a countywide public safety district and a build and privately leased back. What was the, comptroller, did they just accept the report and that was it, or did they make any comments on these financing options?
To my recollection, I don't think they touched on any of those potential options. That was something staff had kind of thought of potential that could potentially, I mean, they may lead nowhere, but potentially it would probably be our due diligence to even look at to see the pros and cons, even if it's possible. But we haven't kind of done a whole lot with that yet because we're kind of, the bulk of the time has been dealing with the GGA process.
I'm sorry?
The bulk of the time, we haven't focused on that in any kind of earnest way, because the bulk of the committee's time has been, and staff time, especially Hal and DPW, have been looking at and working with the GGA firm.
And so what plans do we have with regards to those 2 options? Is there gonna be a presentation to the legislature?
We have to look into, do the legal research to see what is even possible, and even if it's not possible, what legislation you would potentially need if you were to go down one of the paths that the state would have to enact.
Oh, I see, so.
So these may not even be possible. We don't even know. We're at that very preliminary stage of you determining if it's one authorized, and if it's not, what would you have to do to allow it in New York State or for our county?
And other counties have done that, the private and, build private and lease back, and.
Not in New York
Not
State.
in New York.
Okay, and what about public safety districts? That's been done in New York State?
There's at the time when we were looking at some of the solid waste districts, there's a reference to some of the other potential options for districts that counties can enact, and I believe a public safety district is one of them.
And that would include, okay, I get it. Thanks so much for all this work that everybody's done to get this.
So John, I just had one more thing to clear it up in my mind. If it's, you know, because for me, I realize you have to do something with the jail. It's the financial end of it that really, really doesn't work for me. But the 5% interest, it's about $5 million per year for 30 years, and we'll pay back basically $150 million in interest and principal for the total project over 30 years. And I was wondering if we use, you and I had talked, it's a general obligation bond. And with that expenditure, you know, $150 million over 30 years, and you're talking, you know, tax increases one time and then it's layered on for 30 years. So is it a public referendum that we go to for this money, or is, because I did a little research. I know they don't like to go to public referendum. It's not the most popular thing when you have the expense here, but are there other funding methods, or is the general obligation bond what typically we would use?
Yeah, I mean, for something of constructing a facility is historically generally always been done through a general obligation bond. I'm off the top of my head not aware of what other financing mechanism other than looking into these other options.
Is that typical, you think, for?
Yeah, I think that's generally, unless the county just had fund balance on hand, they would issue a general obligation bond to fund the project.
So there would be no public referendum?
Yeah.
And generally,
I mean, say Orange County just did a $300 million
For the
capital
Lebanon zone,
bond
yeah.
issue for.
With a general obligation?
GL
Yeah.
bonds.
and generally with capital assets, you want to bond it over the useful life
Right.
of the asset, as opposed to taking that in.
As opposed to
paying for it out of operating revenues. I mean, it's just kind of standard practice for capital projects.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thought that, I mean, if the facility's gonna be here for 30, 50, 100 years, the residents at the time would be paying it over the life of the bond versus burdening the existing residents in that initial couple of years with the whole cost of the project. So you spread it out over, and equitably over the population as they're here and utilizing the asset.
Okay, any other questions for Josh?
Thanks again.
Okay, good morning, Ed.
Good morning.
How's everything? Have any
It's
reports?
not snowing, we're good.
We've already used half our salt, and did you tell me?
We have used quite a bit of salt already this year, actually.
Oh, boy.
We've used more than we used
No more
last year, I
snow.
think, completely, so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hey,
We're
Corey,
about at a
Corey
half
doesn't
a
need to slip
million.
and fall.
Yeah, but we're done now. You're not.
No
Yeah,
more.
we're done. It's gonna be 40, we're set.
It's gonna warm up, it's gonna be beautiful.
Yeah, we've been rather busy out there so far this year.
You have any report?
No, we're going along with our winter maintenance at this point.
Okay, so then we'll just move to the resolutions, folks. The first resolution is to authorize the county manager to enter an agreement with the New York State Unified Court System for cleaning services. For those of you who do not know that, the state reimburses the county for the services at the courthouse. Motion, Jonathan. Scott, second. Any questions?
No cost, you said, right?
I
No,
said-
this is, we get paid for maintenance. We do the annex building here, the court system there, and at the,
And the state reimburses you, correct?
yes.
Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? 6-0. Good morning, Bill Cutler, how are you?
Good morning.
How many
Happy New
Christmas
Year.
trees did you get?
We don't have a count just yet, but the press releases went out and we are accumulating Christmas trees.
Great, I still have mine up, I'll let you know I'm ready to deliver.
Very good, bring it on in. We're
How's
ready.
everything?
Great.
Good.
Our recycling tonnage is still interim right now for 2013, but the
Okay.
number is approximately 5,139 tons. We'll get another approximately 150 tons for the e-scrap totals once our vendor provides those to us. So our total should be slightly above 2012's annual recycling figures.
Okay.
Our December tonnage was 467 tons, and that does not yet include the Christmas trees.
Okay.
That's for December?
That's for December. Revenue for December was $27,109.99, for an interim total 2013 recycling revenue figure of $339,981.55, excuse me. And currently, we're reevaluating our e-scrap bid. We'll be most likely selecting a new vendor in the next few months.
Okay.
Household hazardous waste specifications are being redesigned for 2014, and we'll have some discussions about that in upcoming committee meetings as well. Plus, all of our fund annual reports from New York State DEC are in progress.
Great,
Yeah.
okay. Any questions for Bill? Okay, any public comment? Ken? We're good?
Well, we should have been at this point on the jail last year. You know,
Ken, I'm
and-
doing the
and-
best I can.
I know you
What can I
can,
say?
and,
It's only 9 years we're talking about it.
Since the board of supervisors,
This
the
is
board of supervisors
2014.
that built it when they would have done it, we would have been paid off and done.
1989, they did a resolution. For those of you, 1989, they did a resolution to stop building the jail. Anyway, thank you. Okay,
I had pods then.
yes.
Jonathan.
Motion to adjourn. Okay, thank you.